All right, baby, settle in, because this story right here is the kind that starts with grief and ends with truth dragging itself into the light, whether anybody's ready or not. I want you to imagine this with me. Black dress. Tight shoes. That heavy kind of silence that sits in the air at funerals where everybody's pretending they weren't part of the problem. The kind of silence that hums in your ears so loud you almost miss the sound of your own breathing. I was standing there, right next to the casket, staring at a face I thought I knew my whole life. And my heart wasn't even broken the way people expect it to be. It was tiring. Confused. Numb in places I didn't know could go numb. And then, a stranger hugged me and whispered, "He told me to give you this if he died." Funerals are supposed to be about closure, about honoring the dead, about saying goodbye and finding peace, but the truth is they're often the most dishonest rooms you'll ever stand in. They are filled with people rehearsing versions of history that feel safest, smoothing over what really happened so nobody has to sit too long with guilt. That's why the silence feels so heavy. It isn't just grief hanging in the air, it's an unspoken truth. You can feel it pressing against your chest, especially when you're the one standing closest to the casket, expected to look the saddest, expected to embody loss in a way that makes everyone else more comfortable. When you lose someone who played a complicated role in your life, grief doesn't come in a neat package. It doesn't look like the movies. Sometimes it shows up as exhaustion. Sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes it's that hollow feeling where you know something mattered deeply, but you can't quite name what you're mourning. At funerals like that, people speak in absolutes. He was a good man. He loved his family. He did his best. And maybe some of those things are true. But what goes unsaid is just as loud. The pauses. The glances. The way certain people avoid your eyes while offering condolences. The way compliments sound more like cover stories than comfort. That's when you start to realize funerals aren't just about the person who died. They're about the stories people tell themselves to survive what they helped create. It's a room full of witnesses pretending they didn't see anything. A place where history gets edited in real time. Where inconvenient details are buried alongside the body, hoping they'll never resurface. And when you're the one who lived with the consequences of those buried details, standing there feels like being trapped inside someone else's lie. There's a strange clarity that comes in moments like that. Not the loud kind, but the quiet, unsettling kind. You notice how grief can be performative. How some tears are genuine and others are strategic. You notice who shows up early and who arrives late, who speaks softly and who speaks too much. You notice how certain people position themselves near you, not out of love, but out of fear that you might say something unexpected. And even if you don't consciously understand why, your body does. Your shoulders tense. Your stomach knots. Your intuition whispers that this moment isn't just about loss, it's about reckoning waiting in the wings. That's why the smallest disruption can feel seismic. A stranger's hug. A sentence that doesn't fit the script. One unexpected act can crack the illusion wide open. Because when everything around you is built on polite denial, truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to show up. And the moment it does, everything else starts to wobble. Suddenly the funeral isn't just a goodbye, it's a threshold. A place where the past and the present collide whether anyone's ready or not. Funerals also have a way of stripping power from the living while pretending to honor the dead. You're expected to be gracious, quiet, forgiving. You're expected to accept comfort instead of asking questions. To absorb words instead of responding to them. And that expectation keeps a lot of truth locked away. Because truth is inconvenient at funerals. It disrupts the narrative. It makes people uncomfortable. It asks for accountability, in a room designed for absolution. But sometimes, grief sharpens rather than dulls. Sometimes it clears the fog instead of thickening it. Standing there, listening to the same polished phrases repeated over and over, you start to recognize how often silence has been mistaken for peace. How many times you were told to let things go for the sake of family harmony. How often discomfort was framed as respect. And in that recognition, something shifts. The funeral stops feeling like an ending and starts feeling like a doorway you didn't know you were allowed to walk through. Because the truth is, funerals don't erase the past. They highlight it. They gather everyone who participated in it into one room and ask them to sit still with themselves for a few hours. Some people can't handle that. Some people spend the whole service managing appearances instead of emotions. And when you're the one who's been carrying unanswered questions for years, you can feel the tension between what's being said out loud and what's echoing underneath every word. That's why this kind of story doesn't start with revenge. It starts with awareness. With that quiet internal moment where you realize your confusion wasn't weakness, it was information. That your discomfort wasn't disrespect, it was intuition. And once that awareness settles in, once you see the funeral for what it really is, you can't unsee it. The space stops being sacred in the way you were taught, and starts being sacred in a different way. A place where truth is finally close enough to touch, even if it hasn't spoken yet. The stranger never announces herself the way you expect. She doesn't come with explanations or credentials, or a long backstory to make you feel safe. She arrives quietly, almost invisibly, blending into the edges of the moment until the timing is right. That's what makes her powerful. In a room full of familiar faces repeating familiar lies, the unfamiliar presence stands out without trying to. There's something unsettling about being seen by someone you don't recognize, especially when they look at you like they already know parts of your story you haven't fully spoken out loud. At a funeral, everyone has a role they've rehearsed. The mourner, the comforter, the silent supporter. The stranger doesn't fit any of those categories, and that's why her presence creates friction. She isn't bound by the unspoken rules of family dynamics. She doesn't owe loyalty to the version of events everyone else agreed to protect. She isn't invested in maintaining the illusion of peace. She exists outside the system, and that distance gives her clarity. When she reaches for you, it isn't out of habit or obligation. It's intentional, purposeful, almost urgent. What makes her hug different isn't the physical act, it's the weight behind it. It carries history you weren't given access to. It carries restraint, years of holding back, of waiting for the right moment to intervene without making things worse. Her words are short because they have to be. There isn't space at a funeral for full truths, only for seeds. And she knows exactly how much to say to make sure the seed takes root. Not enough to cause a scene, but enough to shift the ground beneath your feet. There's a kind of courage in showing up like that. The kind that doesn't demand recognition. She risks being misunderstood, dismissed, or forgotten, and she accepts that because her role isn't to be acknowledged, it's to deliver something important. She understands that truth doesn't always need an audience. Sometimes it only needs the right person. And in that moment, she recognizes you as that person, even if you don't yet recognize yourself as ready. Strangers often carry the truth, because they aren't invested in controlling the outcome. They don't need gratitude. They don't need loyalty. They don't need to manage how the story ends. They just need to make sure it starts moving. And there's something deeply unsettling about realizing someone outside your life has been watching the patterns you've been trapped in. It forces you to confront the idea that what felt private and confusing to you was visible to others all along. The stranger becomes a mirror you didn't ask for. Her calm presence contrasts with the emotional chaos you're standing in. She isn't rushed, even though the moment is fleeting. She doesn't push for conversation. She doesn't ask you to believe her. She simply places the responsibility back into your hands. What you do next is yours to decide. And that autonomy is part of the gift. She doesn't rescue you. She empowers you. There's also grief in her role, even if you don't see it right away. She's carrying her own version of loss. Maybe she tried to speak up before and was silenced. Maybe she paid a price for knowing too much. Maybe she stayed quiet longer than she should have and has lived with that regret. Whatever her story is, it intersects with yours in that brief exchange. Two lives brushing against each other at exactly the right moment, connected by a truth that refused to stay buried. After she disappears, her absence lingers louder than her presence ever was. You replay the moment over and over, analyzing every detail. The tone of her voice. The steadiness of her hands. The way she didn't look surprised by your reaction. She planted something inside you that won't let you rest. A question. A possibility. A sense that there's more beneath the surface than you were ever allowed to see. And once that awareness settles in, you can't go back to the version of yourself who didn't know. The stranger doesn't stay to watch the aftermath, because she doesn't need to. Her job was never to witness the explosion, only to light the fuse. She trusts that the truth will do the rest. That's the quiet power of someone who steps into your story not to take over, but to return something that was always meant to be yours. A missing piece. A withheld explanation. A path forward you didn't know existed. And even though she fades back into the crowd, her presence reshapes everything that comes next. The letter doesn't rush you. It sits there in your hands like it knows exactly how long it took to be written, how many times it was folded and unfolded before it ever reached you. You recognize the handwriting immediately, and that recognition alone carries a weight that tightens your chest. This isn't a note scribbled in haste or guilt. This is deliberate. Careful. The kind of writing that comes from someone who knows they are running out of time, and can no longer afford to lie, even to themselves. As you read, the voice behind the words becomes clear in a way it never was in life. There's no room for charm here, no room for excuses. The tone is stripped down, almost bare. He doesn't ask how you're doing. He doesn't soften the moment with affection. He goes straight to the truth, and that alone tells you everything you need to know about how serious what follows is about to be. The letter isn't meant to comfort you. It's meant to correct the record. Confession has a particular rhythm. It starts slowly, almost cautious, like the truth is testing whether it's safe to come out. He names the things he did, not vaguely, not in ways that leave room for interpretation, but clearly enough that there's no mistaking intention. He admits to decisions made behind closed doors, to conversations you were never invited into, to choices that shaped your life without your consent. Each sentence lands heavier than the last, not because the words are dramatic, but because they explain so much you've carried without context. What hurts isn't just what he did, it's how long he knew. He writes about moments you remember from a completely different angle. Times when you thought you were overreacting. Times when you were told you misunderstood. Times when your questions were met with impatience or silence. The letter reframes those memories one by one, and suddenly your confusion makes sense. The gaps fill in. The inconsistencies line up. And that realization is both devastating and strangely validating. Then the letter shifts. It stops being just a confession and becomes something else entirely. Accountability. He acknowledges the ripple effects of his actions, how they isolated you, how they altered how others saw you, how they limited your access to resources and support you should have had. He admits that the harm wasn't accidental. It was convenient. It served a purpose. And naming that out loud removes the last excuse anyone could make on his behalf. The most unsettling part is how calm the letter feels. There's no dramatic apology, no pleading for forgiveness. Just facts laid out. Plainly, like he understands that forgiveness isn't his to request. That calmness makes the truth sharper. It forces you to sit with it rather than get lost in emotion. And in that stillness, you realize this letter isn't about him unburdening himself. It's about you finally being given the full picture. When you find what else is tucked inside, the letter's intent becomes unmistakable. The additional items aren't sentimental. They are practical. Evidence. Documents. Proof that backs up every word on the page. This isn't a story meant to die with him. It's a record meant to survive. He anticipated disbelief. He anticipated resistance. And he prepared for it. That preparation changes everything, because it shifts the power dynamic completely. The letter doesn't just expose betrayal, it restores agency. It gives you language for things you were never allowed to name. It replaces self-doubt with clarity. The questions you've carried for years finally have answers, and even though those answers hurt, they free you from the exhausting work of wondering what you did wrong. You didn't imagine it. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't mistaken. You were kept in the dark on purpose. As you reach the end, there's a sense that the letter isn't closing a chapter, it's opening one. Not with instructions, but with permission. Permission to act. Permission to investigate. Permission to reclaim what was taken. He doesn't tell you what to do next, because that choice was denied to you for too long already. Instead, he leaves you with the truth and trusts you to decide how to use it. The letter lingers long after you finish reading. Not as a wound, but as a turning point. It marks the moment where the past stops being a mystery and starts being a map. Where pain transforms into information. Where silence gives way to understanding. And in that understanding, something inside you shifts permanently, because once the truth has been named and proven, it can no longer be undone, or ignored. Revenge doesn't always look like raised voices, or slammed doors, or dramatic confrontations that leave everyone shaken. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's patient. Sometimes it looks like doing absolutely nothing while everything inside you is wide awake and paying attention. That's the kind of revenge that lasts, because it isn't driven by impulse, it's driven by clarity. After the truth is revealed, there's a temptation to explode. To confront, to demand answers in real time, but restraint becomes its own kind of power when you understand how systems actually work. The moment you realize the betrayal was intentional, the rules change. This isn't about hurt feelings anymore, it's about patterns, records, and consequences. That's when confrontation becomes the least effective option. People who benefit from manipulation are prepared for emotional reactions. They expect tears, accusations, anger. They know how to spin those moments into proof that you're unstable or overreacting. What they don't expect is silence paired with strategy. They don't expect you to step back, observe, and start assembling a plan without alerting anyone. Quiet revenge begins with information. Not just knowing what happened, but understanding how it happened and who was involved at every level. It means reading documents slowly. Asking professionals questions instead of family members. Verifying timelines. Making copies. Keeping records. It's unglamorous work, and that's why it's effective. While others are assuming you're grieving or distracted, you're learning where the leverage actually is. There's a particular kind of satisfaction in letting people believe they're safe while you're quietly closing the exits. You still show up to family events. You still exchange pleasantries. You still listen. And in doing so, You gather more than they realize. People reveal a lot when they think they've won. They get careless. They contradict themselves. They relax into arrogance. And all of that becomes useful later. Strategic revenge isn't about destroying someone publicly right away. It's about removing their control piece by piece. It's about addressing things through the proper channels so that when consequences arrive, they can't be dismissed as personal attacks. Legal notices don't argue. Financial audits don't negotiate emotions. Official records don't care about family titles or history. They care about facts. And facts are relentless. What makes this kind of revenge so effective is that it forces accountability without you having to beg for it. You don't need anyone to admit what they did. You don't need apologies. You don't need validation. The systems do that work for you. When accounts are frozen, when assets are questioned, when reputations are examined under formal scrutiny, the truth surfaces whether anyone wants it to or not. There's also dignity in this approach. You don't lose yourself to rage. You don't compromise your credibility. You don't give anyone ammunition to turn the narrative against you. You let the truth stand on its own, supported by evidence, timing, and restraint. And that restraint protects you in ways anger never could. It keeps you grounded, focused, clear about why you're doing what you're doing. Quiet revenge also creates a different kind of aftermath. Instead of chaos, there's clarity. Instead of shouting matches, there are consequences that unfold methodically. People who built their power on secrecy and manipulation find themselves exposed not through scandal, but through process. And the process is hard to escape. It follows rules. It leaves trails. It demands answers. The moment when they realize what's happening is almost anticlimactic. There's no grand reveal, no dramatic speech. Just a shift in their behavior. The phone calls. The sudden politeness. The requests to talk privately. The offers to explain. And that's when you know it's working. Not because they are scared of you, but because they are scared of what they can't control anymore. Revenge like this isn't about cruelty. It's about corrections. It's about restoring balance where there was abuse of power. It's about ensuring that harm has a cost that matches its impact. And in the process, something unexpected happens. You stop feeling reactive. You stop replaying old conversations in your head. You stop needing closure from the very people who denied you the truth for so long. Because the real victory isn't watching them fall apart. It's watching yourself rise without becoming what hurts you. It's realizing that you don't need to burn everything down to reclaim what's yours. You just need to be precise, patient, willing to let the truth move at its own pace. And when it finally does, it lands exactly where it's supposed to land, leaving no doubt about who was responsible and who survived with their integrity intact. Reclaiming your voice doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive with a single conversation or a dramatic announcement. It happens in layers, quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, as you begin to notice how differently you breathe when you're no longer carrying someone else's version of you. For so long, your identity was shaped by what you were told, what was withheld, what was quietly decided for you. You learned to second-guess yourself, because doubt was planted early and reinforced often. So when the truth finally comes into focus, the first thing you reclaim isn't confidence, it's clarity. Clarity changes everything. It reframes the past in a way that releases you from shame you were never meant to carry. You stop asking why you weren't enough and start seeing how carefully the game was rigged. You recognize how often your silence was mistaken for consent, how compliance was confused with agreement. And once you see that, your voice begins to return, not as a shout, but as a steady presence that no longer needs permission to exist. There's a powerful shift that happens when you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to people who benefited from misunderstanding you. You stop rehearsing justifications in your head. You stop anticipating objections. You stop softening your truth to make it easier for others to swallow. That's when control changes hands. Not because you took it from someone else, but because you finally took it back for yourself. Reclaiming identity also means grieving the version of yourself that had to survive without answers. The one who adapted, who learned to minimize, who accepted less than they deserved because they were told that was all that was available. That grief is real, and it deserves space. But it doesn't define the future. It becomes part of your foundation instead of your prison. You honor it by choosing differently now. As your voice strengthens, something else follows. Boundaries. Clear ones. You no longer feel obligated to stay accessible to everyone. You understand that access is earned, not inherited. You become more intentional with your energy, your time, your trust. And that selectiveness isn't bitterness, it's discernment. It's knowing that peace requires protection. Public restoration matters too, even if you pretend it doesn't at first. There's a relief in having the record corrected, in knowing that lies don't get the final word. Not because you need applause, but because truth deserves acknowledgement. Being seen accurately, especially after years of distortion, is deeply grounding. It anchors you back into yourself. It affirms that your experience was real, valid, and worthy of being recognized. With that recognition comes freedom. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that loosens its grip. You stop living in reaction to old wounds. You stop bracing for harm that no longer has access to you. You begin making choices based on desire instead of defense. That's when life starts to feel expansive again, not because everything is perfect, but because it's finally honest. Your voice also becomes a tool, not just for yourself, but for others who are still where you once were. When you speak, you do so with intention, aware of the weight words can carry. You don't need to overshare or convince. Your truth stands on its own. And in standing firm, it gives others permission to question the stories they've been told about themselves. Control, once reclaimed, doesn't look like dominance. It looks like peace. It looks like knowing you can walk away. It looks like I don't need the last word. It looks like choosing when and how you engage, rather than being pulled into cycles you didn't create. That kind of control is quiet, but it's unshakable. What you gain in the end isn't revenge in the traditional sense. It's authorship. You become the one who defines your narrative moving forward. You decide what matters, what stays, what goes. You live from a place of alignment rather than obligation. And that alignment is powerful because it's sustainable. When everything that was taken has been restored, not just materially but emotionally, you realize the true victory was never about what they lost. It was about what you found. Your voice. Your identity. Your authority over your own life. And once those are firmly in your hands, no one gets to take them from you again.